The ocean does not begin at the shoreline. It begins where light gives up. And this is where the story truly opens. Not with waves, not with storms, but with a sudden, inexplicable silence as the research vessel Ardent crosses a point on the Atlantic that no map marks and no sailor names, a dead zone where compasses hesitate and sonar pulses return just a fraction of a second too late. Enough to make seasoned crew members exchange glances they refuse to explain, because everyone aboard feels it at the same time. The sensation of being watched from below, not hunted, not threatened, but assessed, as if the sea itself is deciding whether they are worth noticing. The mission is simple on paper, a routine deep-sea survey following a cluster of anomalous readings detected weeks earlier by an automated buoy that stopped transmitting after sending one final data packet stamped with an impossible oxygen signature from nearly 4 kilometers down, a depth where air cannot exist, where stone collapses and steel screams. And yet the readings persist, repeating like a heartbeat, slow and patient, and as the remotely operated vehicle is lowered into the water, its descent displayed across a dozen monitors glowing pale blue in the ship's dim control room, the crew watches the surface vanish, then the twilight zone, then the long fall into blackness where the camera lights carve narrow tunnels through particulate clouds drifting like ash, and the narrator's voice, low, restrained, uneasy, cuts in to remind us that more than 80% of the ocean remains unexplored, not because we lack curiosity, but because something down there resists being known. Minutes stretch, pressure readings climb, metal groans faintly through the hull, and then, without warning, the sonar image on the main screen glitches. Not static, not interference, but a shape resolving too cleanly to be natural. Vertical lines where there should be chaos, symmetry where there should be collapse, architecture where there should only be sediment. And when the camera adjusts and the lights brighten, the crew collectively stops breathing, because rising from the seabed like a memory dragged from the past stands a structure no one is prepared to see. A church, intact, upright, unmistakably human in design, yet profoundly wrong in placement, its stone walls unbroken by time, its spire truncated but deliberate, as if it was never meant to reach the surface, arches casting shadows that fall at angles the light cannot justify, and stained glass windows still set into their frames, opaque with centuries of mineral growth, yet unshattered, bearing faint outlines of figures kneeling not toward the sky, but downward toward the deep. And in that moment, the first hook sinks in. This is not a ruin, not a shipwreck pre-purposed by imagination, but something preserved, protected, as if the ocean itself has been instructed to leave it untouched. Whispered voices fill the control room, a marine engineer muttering dates that don't belong here, a historian quietly identifying Gothic elements that should not survive such pressure, while the drone drifts closer and reveals carvings along the outer walls, reliefs of elongated humanoid forms with gill-like slits etched into their necks, eyes too large, mouths open in what might be prayer or might be awe, surrounding a central figure, crowned with coral and tendrils, a figure whose face has been deliberately eroded as if even stone feared remembering it. And then the second hook tightens, as the drone's sensors spike violently, not with danger alarms, but with impossibility, internal pressure equalizing, oxygen levels rising, humidity dropping, data streams confirming what logic rejects, that inside this church, at the bottom of the ocean, there is breathable air. And before anyone can argue, before protocols can be invoked, the camera angle shifts and reveals the doors, massive, wooden, iron-banded doors, already open, not forced apart, not broken by time or tide, but opened as if an invitation.
And the silence that follows is heavier than sound, because now the question is no longer how this place exists, but why it is waiting. Against better judgment, driven by that fatal human instinct to look closer when we should turn away, the drone crosses the threshold, and the moment it does, the audio feed changes. Background static flattening into a hollow calm, as though the water itself has been shut out, revealing an interior lit by rows of candles burning with steady, unnatural flames that do not flicker despite the movement of the drone, wax unmelted, wicks unblackened, arranged along stone pews that stretch toward an altar at the far end of the nave. And seated in those pews, this is where fear truly begins, are figures, dozens of them, motionless, upright, arranged with deliberate reverence, their bodies humanoid but distorted, skin pale and semi-translucent like deep-sea flesh never meant to meet light, veins visible beneath like dark river systems, fingers elongated and webbed resting calmly on their laps, heads bowed in silent devotion, and for several seconds nothing moves, the crew frozen, the audience held in breathless suspension, until a quiet realization creeps in. The bodies show no signs of decay, no collapse, no drifting sediment, meaning they are not dead, and as the drone's light pass over them, tiny movements become visible, subtle expansions along their necks, slow rhythmic pulses, gills opening and closing in unison, breathing, synchronized, disciplined, alive. And then the final twist of Act One strikes without warning, without sound, without mercy, as every single head in the congregation lifts at the exact same instant, movements precise and mechanical, faces turning not toward the altar, not toward the light, but directly to the camera, eyes glossy and black reflecting the drone's glow like mirrors, locking onto the lens as if they have been watching the surface all along, waiting for this moment, and the control room erupts into panicked whispers just as the drone's audio feed crackles and a voice emerges. Not loud, not monstrous, but calm, ancient, intimate, speaking with the confidence of something that has never needed to raise its voice. And it says, simply, with the weight of centuries behind it, "You are late."
Hey everyone! If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more awesome videos. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an update. The voice does not echo inside the church, because echoes require empty space, and this place is anything but empty. It presses against the drone's microphones like breath against glass, calm and intimate, as if it has spoken to explorers before and knows exactly how much fear to apply. And when it says, "You are late," the words carry no accusation, only certainty, as though time itself has failed rather than the intruders. And for a moment, the crew aboard the Ardent forgets to react, frozen in that terrible gap between discovery and understanding, while the congregation remains seated, eyes fixed on the camera with an intensity that feels almost tender, almost curious. And the candles lining the nave begin to burn brighter, their flames stretching upward unnaturally, casting shadows that do not align with the bodies that should be creating them. Shadows that bend toward the altar instead, crawling across the stone floor like living things. The drone's instruments flicker wildly now, pressure readings oscillating between surface-level normalcy and abyssal extremes, oxygen meters fluctuating as if something is inhaling the air in long, deliberate breaths. And the marine biologist whispers that the gill movements are synchronized not by chance, but by rhythm, like a choir holding its breath between verses. And that is when the first figure in the front pew stands, joints unfolding with a sound like wet parchment tearing, its posture reverent rather than aggressive, movements slow and ritualistic, followed by another and another,
until the entire congregation rises as one, revealing bodies that are taller than human proportions, spines subtly curved, ribs faintly visible beneath translucent skin. And as they turn toward the altar, the drone's camera catches something far more unsettling than their forms. Their faces are peaceful, serene even, marked not by madness or hunger, but by devotion so complete it has erased fear. And the voice speaks again, now resonating from everywhere and nowhere, explaining without being asked that this place is not a sanctuary but a duty, not a house of worship but a boundary, that long before humans learned to cross oceans, something else learned to cross upward, and so the church was built downward instead, stone laid upon stone by hands that once belonged to surface dwellers who are offered a choice rather than a threat, to guard the deep in exchange for survival, to become something more than human in order to remain alive. And as the voice recounts this ancient pact, the drone glides closer to the altar, revealing carvings along its base depicting tidal waves held back by kneeling figures, coastal cities intact beneath calm seas, and beneath them all, a vast shape pressed against the underside of the world like a god asleep beneath thin ice. And the hook tightens as the voice admits that the congregation's prayers are not requests, but maintenance, a continuous act of containment, because the being they serve does not hunger for flesh alone, but for remembrance, for acknowledgement, for the sound of its name spoken with reverence. And when the modern world forgot, when faith shifted upward toward the sky and away from the depths, the prayers weakened, the tides grew restless, and the ocean began to test its chains. The crew realizes with dawning horror that the anomaly detected weeks ago was not the church announcing itself, but the first missed prayer, a moment of silence long enough for something ancient to stir. And as if to punctuate this realization, one of the congregation steps aside to reveal a massive crack running along the altar floor, stone fractured from below, and from that crack emerges a low vibration felt even through the drone's chassis, a pulse that causes every candle flame to bow inward as though kneeling, while the voice whispers that the intruders are not trespassers, but replacements, because the old congregation is failing, their bodies thinning, their devotions stretched thin by centuries of vigilance, and the sea, patient as it is cruel, has finally allowed humanity to descend far enough to be noticed, and that is when the figures turn back toward the drone, eyes gleaming with something dangerously close to hope. The realization hits the control room like a physical blow. The church does not want them gone, it wants them involved. And as the captain orders an immediate withdrawal, overriding every instinct screaming that they have crossed a line that should never have been drawn on any map, the drone begins to reverse, thrusters humming louder than before, yet the distance between it and the altar does not change, the nave stretching unnaturally, pews elongating, space itself bending as though geometry has become a suggestion rather than a rule, and the voice speaks again, softer now, almost regretful, explaining that retreat is a surface instinct, a learned response born of predators and prey, but the deep operates on patience, on inevitability, on the understanding that all things sink eventually. And as if responding to this philosophy, the massive doors of the church swing shut without a sound, sealing the drone inside with a finality that feels ceremonial rather than violent, iron bands locking into place, cutting off any illusion of escape, while the congregation begins to chant, not aloud, not with mouths, but through the low-frequency vibrations that ripple through the stone and the drone's hull alike, a sound felt in bones rather than heard, causing crew members aboard the Ardent to clutch their heads as memories surface unbidden, flashes of drowning dreams, of being pulled downward by calm hands, of oceans rising silently over sleeping cities. And the altar begins to change, carving shifting, stone flowing like wax as ancient mechanisms awaken, revealing that the statue of Dagon is not a statue at all, but a sheath, a shell designed to give form to something that cannot fully exist within human perception. And as the shell cracks open, the drone's cameras struggle to focus, lenses fogging, auto-calibration failing as if the image itself resists being recorded. Yet enough comes through to shatter any remaining doubt. A vast presence pressing upward from beneath the altar, skin like folded continents, eyes opening and closing in patterns that match the tides above, each blink accompanied by seismic tremors detected across the Atlantic basin. And the voice finally names itself not as Dagon, but a servant of Dagon, a memory given sound, explaining that the god does not speak because gods do not need to convince. They only need to be acknowledged, and the world above has grown too loud, too distracted, too arrogant to remember what sleeps beneath it. And so the church has been found not by accident, but by necessity, because belief has power, attention has weight, and now millions will listen, will fear, will speak the name again, feeding the deep with the oldest currency of all. The final twist of the act lands as the congregation kneels once more, not in surrender, but in release. Bodies collapsing inward, forms unraveling into streams of pale biomass that flow toward the altar crack like offerings returned to the source, revealing that the wardens were never meant to survive the awakening, only to delay it long enough for witnesses to arrive. And as the drone's feed destabilizes, the last clear image transmitted shows the altar fully opening into a living abyss, a vertical ocean within the ocean, breathing slowly, deliberately, while the voice delivers its final message, calm and absolute. The prayers are no longer enough. Now the world must remember. And above the surface, far from the trench, tides begin to shift without wind or moon, coastlines groan, and humanity unknowingly takes its first breath in an age where the deep is no longer content to remain silent.
The world does not end with fire or light or noise. It begins to end with water behaving incorrectly, with tides that arrive early and refuse to leave, with waves that rise without storms and oceans that breathe when they should be still. And the first sign that something has gone irreversibly wrong appears not near the trench, not near the church, but thousands of miles away, when coastal sensors in 3 different continents register identical anomalies within the same second, water levels rising and falling in slow, deliberate pulses, as if responding to a distant heartbeat. And meteorologists scramble for explanations that never come, because the moon remains unchanged, the wind unmoving, the sky indifferent, and yet the seas begin to synchronize, swelling and retreating together across hemispheres that should never agree. Aboard the Ardent, the crew watches this unfold in mounting horror as emergency broadcasts flood the control room, each report more impossible than the last, harbors draining themselves dry before refilling minutes later, underwater communication cables humming with low-frequency vibrations that corrupt data and induce nausea in anyone who listens too long, whales abandoning migratory routes followed for millennia to beach themselves in perfect lines along coastlines, their massive bodies shuddering as if responding to a call too deep for human ears. And through it all, the drone feed from the church continues to transmit in broken fragments, distorted images of the altar's living abyss opening wider with each pulse, its edges flexing like muscle rather than stone, while the voice, no longer confined to the church, begins to appear in recordings worldwide, slipping into background noise, whispered through static on radios, murmured beneath emergency announcements, never loud enough to be isolated, but always present, always saying the same thing in 1,000 languages and none at all. Remember.
Governments attempt containment, shutting down oceanic research, rerouting shipping lanes, blacking out satellite feeds over key regions. But secrecy collapses faster than infrastructure when footage leaks of entire coastlines retreating by kilometers, only to surge back with surgical precision, avoiding destruction as if restraint is a choice rather than a limitation. And in this controlled chaos emerges the most terrifying realization yet. The ocean is no longer reacting, it is responding, not to weather, not to gravity, but to something awake beneath it. Deep below, far from cameras and prayers, another movement stirs. Older than the church, older than the pact, something that was never meant to be worshipped or contained, but deployed. And as ancient texts resurface, forgotten fragments dismissed as myth, warnings encoded in sailor superstitions and coastal taboos, a name begins to surface alongside Dagon's, spoken not with reverence, but with fear. Scylla, not a monster, not a beast, but an instrument, a living threshold designed to enforce the boundary between surface and abyss. And the twist lands like a knife as analysts realize the truth hidden in the carvings beneath the altar. Scylla was never Dagon's servant, she was his jailer, positioned at the narrowest passages of the world's oceans, at straits and trenches where the deep presses closest to the surface, feeding not out of hunger, but necessity, consuming intruders, ships, even civilizations that ventured too near, maintaining balance through terror. And now, as Dagon's awakening weakens the ancient architecture of restraint, Scylla stirs for the first time in centuries, her presence announced not by sight, but by absence, by shipping lanes going silent, by sonar returning nothing but screaming static, by entire underwater landscapes collapsing as something vast moves sideways through the dark. Fishermen vanish, then naval patrols, then entire island chains lose contact as the sea around them grows unnaturally calm, glassy and reflective, until without warning, it erupts. Not upward, but inward, folding around itself as Scylla surfaces just enough to remind the world why gods once feared guardians, her many heads rising like towers from the water, each mouth a cathedral of teeth, each scream generating pressure waves that rupture hulls and fracture coastlines. And yet, she does not rampage blindly. She positions herself with purpose, blocking passages, severing routes, enforcing ancient borders humanity never knew existed, while above, the voice of Dagon grows stronger, clearer, no longer content with whispers, no longer patient, announcing through dreams and waking hallucinations that the age of silence has ended, that the sea remembers its kings, that the surface will kneel or drown. And in a final devastating convergence, the crew of the Ardent realizes the role they were always meant to play as the church's last transmission stabilizes for a brief, horrifying moment, revealing Scylla's shadow passing beneath the altar's abyss, her presence causing the living stone to recoil, proving that even gods have limits, even awakenings have consequences. And as the voice fractures into something strained, something uncertain, it becomes clear that humanity's intrusion has not freed Dagon, but destabilized the entire system of cosmic balance that kept the ocean from claiming the world outright. The act closes on a chilling equilibrium, not victory, not apocalypse, but stalemate. As Scylla rises fully to reclaim her duty, Dagon's awakening stalls incomplete, the tides settle into an unnatural rhythm that may hold for days or centuries. And the final narration delivers its quiet devastation. The ocean was never empty, never asleep, never ours to explore without cost. And now that humanity has been seen, remembered, and marked, the deep will never again pretend to be silent. Because silence was not absence, it was restraint. Humanity has always believed the end would announce itself loudly, with fire in the sky, with sirens, with gods descending in obvious wrath. But when the ocean finally turns its attention upward, it does so with restraint, so deliberate it becomes unbearable. And the first truth that spreads faster than panic is this:
The sea is choosing, sparing some coastlines while erasing others, advancing to the edge of cities only to stop, as if reconsidering, as if listening for something that never comes. Emergency summits convene across continents, screens filled with leaders speaking in careful tones that betray terror behind rehearsed calm, while scientists abandon language like anomaly and phenomenon in favor of older, heavier words: pattern, intent, response. And still, no one dares say what everyone understands. The ocean is no longer a force of nature, it is a participant, and participation implies judgment. Naval fleets are mobilized not to attack, but to observe. Submarines descending into regions once mapped and now unreadable, their sonar returning layered echoes that overlap in impossible ways, revealing voids where water should exist and masses where nothing should fit. And some of those submarines never return, their last transmissions filled not with alarms, but confusion. Captains reporting calm seas and perfect visibility moments before feeds cut out, as if whatever encountered them preferred quiet to struggle. Along coastlines, religious gatherings swell overnight, ancient sea gods resurrected in whispered prayers, offerings cast into the waves by people who feel instinctively that belief itself has weight again, while others flee inland in endless convoys, only to stop when they realize rivers are reversing, tides creeping upstream, salt water contaminating groundwater far from any shore, reminding them that distance no longer guarantees safety. Aboard the Ardent, now drifting under international quarantine orders, the remaining crew watches the world fracture through fractured feeds, knowing with sick clarity that this is not an invasion, but a reckoning, that humanity is not being punished for arrogance alone, but for forgetting the terms of an ancient silence that allowed civilization to grow unchallenged. And the voice, now unmistakable, now impossible to deny, begins to speak not just through noise, but through people, emerging in shared dreams reported across cultures, children drawing the same crowned figure with eyes like trenches, adults waking with salt on their lips and words they do not remember speaking, written in languages they have never learned, all repeating variations of the same message. The balance was maintained. The guard was posted, the prayers were sufficient, until they were not. Desperate, fragmented, and driven by the oldest impulse of control, a coalition authorizes what will later be remembered as the Last Descent, a manned expedition to the church beneath the church, justified publicly as a rescue or recovery mission, but understood privately as a negotiation attempt, because if the deep has rules, then perhaps it can still be reasoned with. And so a single reinforced submersible is dispatched, carrying scientists, theologians, linguists, and one survivor from a coastal village who claims to have heard the voice clearly and lived, descending past layers of water that grow unnaturally warm, unnaturally still, until pressure ceases to rise altogether, signaling the approach of a space that is no longer entirely physical. As they descend, the crew begins to experience temporal distortions, minutes stretching into hours, heartbeats syncing with the same distant pulse detected by global sensors, until the church comes into view once more. Changed now, its structure warped, stone veined with bioluminescent growths that pulse like exposed nerves, doors no longer present because thresholds are no longer needed. And as the submersible approaches, something vast moves beneath it, not attacking, not obstructing, merely passing, its shadow resolving into the unmistakable form of Scylla, her many heads gliding past like watchtowers in motion, mouths closed, eyes unblinking, enforcing her ancient patrol not out of loyalty to humanity or hatred of gods, but out of function. And in that moment, the crew understands the most horrifying truth yet. Scylla is not angry, not awakened improperly, not corrupted. She is correcting an error, responding to imbalance with surgical precision, and the imbalance is humanity itself. Inside the church, the abyss beneath the altar has widened into a vertical sea, its surface rippling upward instead of down, and the voice manifests clearly at last, no longer whispering, no longer borrowing sound, but speaking directly into the minds of those present, explaining with unbearable calm that the world above mistook freedom for entitlement, exploration for ownership, forgetting that survival was conditional, least, granted during an age when restraint was maintained by guardians and worship alike. And now that guardians have been challenged and worship diluted into curiosity, the lease is under review. The negotiation collapses not in violence, but in futility, because the voice is not hostile, it is final, stating that the surface has grown too loud, too disruptive, too unbalanced to be left unchecked, and that correction does not require extinction, only reduction, only silence restored to acceptable levels. And as Scylla's presence presses closer, causing the submersible's hull to creak under pressures that no longer registered numerically, the crew is given a choice framed as mercy: withdrawal from the seas, abandonment of coasts, surrender of the depths forever, or enforcement will continue until equilibrium is restored by absence rather than agreement. The act collapses not in violence, but in futility, because the voice is not hostile, it is final, stating that the surface is growing too loud, too disruptive, too unbalanced to be left unchecked, and that correction does not require extinction, only reduction, only silence restored to acceptable levels. And as Scylla's presence presses closer, causing the submersible's hull to creak under pressures that no longer register numerically, the crew is given a choice framed as mercy: withdrawal from the seas, abandonment of coasts, surrender of the depths forever, or enforcement will continue until equilibrium is restored by absence rather than agreement. The act ends not with a decision, but with failure, as seismic activity erupts worldwide, trenches widening, new straits tearing open through continents, oceans reclaiming ancient paths, and the final transmission from the descent captures Scylla turning one massive eye toward the camera, not in threat, not in rage, but in acknowledgement, before the feed cuts, leaving the surface world to confront a truth more terrifying than annihilation. The beep does not hate us, and that is why it is willing to erase us. The end does not arrive as a single moment, because the ocean does not believe in endings, only in tides, and what follows the failed descent is not immediate annihilation, but something far more terrifying: order, imposed slowly, deliberately, across a world that has forgotten how to kneel. Coastlines are not swallowed overnight, but redrawn inch by inch, harbors rendered unusable as currents shift against engineering logic, ports collapsing not from storms, but from stillness, as water refuses to move when commanded, leaving ships stranded in dry docks that were never meant to empty, and governments announce emergency adaptations that sound suspiciously like surrender, entire cities scheduled for relocation inland, sea lanes abandoned, underwater infrastructure written off as lost, while the oceans themselves grow eerily calm, surface waters smoothing into mirror-like expanses that reflect the sky with unsettling precision, as though the sea is practicing restraint rather than aggression. Across the globe, people begin to dream the same dream, not of drowning, not of monsters, but of standing on ancient shores beneath unfamiliar stars, watching something vast move beneath shallow waves, while voices explain patiently that this world has flooded and receded many times, that civilizations are temporary arrangements, and that memory is the true casualty, because each time the sea rises, the land forgets who it belonged to. Scientists finally piece together what the church was never meant to explain in words: that the ancient pact was not designed to protect humanity from gods, but to protect gods from humanity, whose relentless expansion, extraction, and noise had begun to fracture the deep long before technology made exploration possible. And Scylla, once mythologized as a monster, was engineered, grown, shaped,
tasked as a living corrective, consuming not out of cruelty, but necessity, erasing incursions before they could become destabilizations, a guardian whose hunger was calibrated to curiosity, whose violence increased only when boundaries were ignored. And now, with the pact broken and the prayers reduced to data points and curiosity clicks, Scylla's role expands beyond narrow straits into global enforcement, her movements mapped not by satellites, which fail whenever she passes beneath, but by absence, by regions of ocean where nothing enters and nothing returns, creating expanding zones of perfect silence that oceanographers come to fear more than storms, because silence means compliance is being enforced. The voice of Dagon fades during this time, not because it has been
Long after the alarms faded and the world learned to live with new shorelines, after maps were redrawn and old ports became inland ruins visited only by wind and memory, the ocean settled into a calm so profound it unnerved even those who had begged for peace, because stillness, when it lasts too long, begins to feel like observation rather than rest. And it was during this unnatural quiet that the final truth revealed itself. Not through catastrophe, not through divine proclamation, but through absence, through the slow realization that something essential had been removed from the world without anyone noticing the moment it happened, as if the sea had taken not cities or lives, but permission, the unspoken right humanity once believed it possessed to go anywhere, to touch anything, to name the unknowable and call it progress. Ships no longer vanished because ships no longer sailed far enough to vanish. Satellites avoided wide swaths of ocean where signals folded into themselves and returned distorted or not at all. And sonar buoys placed too deep stopped transmitting not abruptly, but politely, completing their final data packet before going silent, a courtesy that frightened scientists more than any violent failure ever could, because it suggested intention, and in that intention lay restraint rather than rage. Children born after the silence grew up hearing stories about beaches the way earlier generations spoke of ancient empires, with disbelief and nostalgia intertwined, learning that the sea was not gone, but withdrawn, a presence that could be felt on certain nights when tides pulled inland just far enough to remind the land where it once ended. And on those nights, people across the world reported the same sensation, the sense of being measured, not judged, simply acknowledged, as though something vast was checking to see if the surface remembered the lesson it had been taught. The last remaining oceanographers eventually noticed the pattern no one wanted to name, that the tides still moved in unison across hemispheres, subtly synchronized to a rhythm no celestial body could explain, and that rhythm matched the same low-frequency pulse first recorded beneath the church decades earlier, meaning the source had never left, never slept, never retreated, only repositioned itself into a state of watchful equilibrium. And when old footage from the Ardent was restored using technology that did not exist at the time of its recording, a detail previously missed emerged in the final frames before transmission ended, not the shadow of Scylla passing beneath the altar, not the opening abyss, but something far quieter and more disturbing. The congregation, reformed, kneeling once more, their numbers fewer but their posture unchanged, suggesting the pact had not ended but evolved, shifting from worship to observation, from containment to surveillance. And the voice, when it appeared again in recovered audio, was no longer commanding or explanatory, but contemplative, as if addressing itself rather than humanity, murmuring that correction had been sufficient, that balance had been restored for now, and that the surface world had been granted something unprecedented, time to decide what kind of noise it would make when the deep inevitably listened again. Years later, a lone research drone, launched without authorization by a scientist who had spent her life studying silence rather than sound, descended just far enough to cross an invisible threshold, and instead of failing, instead of being crushed or erased, it stopped, suspended in water that felt neither dense nor empty, And the camera recorded nothing extraordinary at first, only darkness and distant bioluminescence drifting like stars, until slowly, deliberately, something moved at the edge of perception, not approaching, not retreating, simply existing alongside the lens. And in that moment, the scientist understood what the world had misunderstood all along. The ocean had never been hiding monsters. It had been hiding guardians, systems older than fear, older than gods, mechanisms of balance so vast they could afford patience. And Scylla was not gone, Dagon was not defeated, the church was not destroyed. They had merely adjusted their posture in response to a species that had finally learned, however briefly, to listen. The drone returned unharmed, its final recording showing nothing definitive, nothing to provoke panic or wonder, just a slow fade into black accompanied by a single, low vibration that analysts would later confirm matched the global tidal pulse exactly, and the scientist never published her findings, choosing instead to seal them away with a handwritten note that read only, "The ocean did not forgive us, it acknowledged us." The final narration lingers on the world as it exists now. Quiet coasts, restricted waters, civilizations turned inward, skies reflected in seas that no longer invite reflection, and leaves the audience with a truth too subtle to argue against and too heavy to ignore, that the deep did not rise to conquer the surface, did not fall back into myth, but remains precisely where it has always been, vast and patient and awake, listening not for prayers or machines or footsteps in the water, but for the moment humanity forgets again that silence was never emptiness, that the calm sea is not asleep, and that the most terrifying thing beneath the waves was never what would happen if the gods rose, but what would happen if they decided, quietly, collectively, and without malice, to stop holding the world back.